Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for animals. On this episode, from factory farms to laboratories, the biggest cases from PETA's Cruelty Investigations Department.
There was no food at the facility. There was a rotten head of lettuce. There were reptiles, meaning snakes and turtles and lizards. There were scorpions and spiders and sloths and hamsters and hedgehogs and chinchillas. I mean, he just dealt in anything and everything that he could make a penny on with just absolutely no decency whatsoever.
PETA's Senior Vice President of Cruelty Investigations, Daphna Nachminovich, describing one of the biggest cases ever, where 27,000 animals were seized at the now-defunct U.S. Global Exotics in Texas. It's just one of the many cases that she recalls in her time leading the fight against everything from animal supply houses to factory farms that sell your food. One case with Hormel in 2008 was especially heinous.
There were descriptions by workers of workers penetrating sows with crowbars and things like that. Totally appalling. I mean, the entire operation is something out of a horror movie. I mean, you've got, when we say factory farm, we don't mean, a dozen or 100 pigs. It's a massive, massive warehouse that contains 6,000 plus pigs. It is literally a factory farm, and these animals are seen as nothing but meat production.
More with Daphna, but first, I just want to thank you again for being part of our listening audience on the PETA Podcast and for the opportunity to do some good for the animals 24/7 via these programs on the internet. To help us out, please go to the podcast player with the PETA rabbit, and on the notes, you'll find a brief survey. Please fill it out. It'll help us grow the podcast. You can also send a link of the show to your friends and let them know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. And if you've missed any of our shows, catch up and binge listen, including Episode 1, My Conversation with PETA President and co-founder Ingrid Newkirk. What does Ingrid think about no-kill shelters? Well, you can find out on the PETA Podcast. Check out the links on the podcast player or on PETA.org or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're also in the midst of the horse racing season with the Kentucky Derby coming up. Listen to how PETA is working to end animal abuse in that so-called sport. Check out all our previous episodes, and if you're on an Apple device, please rate and review. It lets Apple know you care about the issues we talk about on the PETA Podcast.
Of course, the victories are always so sweet for the animals who are liberated from these hellholes. Personally, when you have to fight for something so hard and it's the right thing and you've been up, night after night strategizing and devising and cajoling authorities and offering help and fundraising to offer resources, the victory is so meaningful because it's justice.
Shutting down labs, saving animals is hard work, but for Daphna Nachminovich, Senior VP and head of PETA's Cruelty Investigations, it's worth it when you're able to stop people in the act of abusing animals. And surely PETA doesn't do it alone. In my conversation, Daphna talks about her work and how whistleblowers have been behind some of the biggest cases in PETA history, from the U.S. Global Exotics case in Texas to the Global Captive Breeders case in Southern California to the big Hormel factory farm case in Iowa. My conversation with Daphna on how PETA is fearless when it comes to protecting the animals.
We go after anyone who abuses animals, whether they are an individual or a corporation. The Cruelty Investigations Department includes not just our hands-on division, our field division, but also our undercover eyewitness investigations, which focus on anyone who abuses animals, whether it is a circus, a blood bank using discarded racing greyhounds, as we recently exposed, a laboratory, a puppy mill, a factory farm or a slaughterhouse, we respond to tips from whistleblowers, and we do our best to expose conditions for animals so that consumers make the most compassionate, humane decisions when they make their daily choices.
Yeah, when I think of cruelty investigations, to me, because of my background, it almost seems like a combination of Watergate and Woodward and Bernstein and Perry Mason and a little bit of investigative journalism. But it really is. You do very detailed investigations.
We do detailed investigations that are big scale, and also we do detailed investigations when it comes to our hands-on work in the field. If a dog has starved to death, or a dog is being neglected, or a cat, or any other animal.
And you depend on whistleblowers, or do you have people actually going out there and trying to find out or ferret out these malfeasance wherever you find it, or primarily whistleblowers?
We don't depend on whistleblowers, but we most definitely take whistleblower calls and do our best to respond to them. Some of our investigations were born, if so to speak, thanks to whistleblowers. As an example, the recent pet blood bank in Cherokee, Texas, which we exposed and eventually shut down. Our complainant was a whistleblower, and the documentation that we shared with the public came from him. And some of our other undercover investigations over the years were also based on whistleblower tips, but we don't depend exclusively on whistleblowers. Occasionally, we happen upon a facility, if you will, or we know, for example, with another recent investigation that we published, BioCorp in Minnesota, we know that we would like to educate the public with new information, more recent information about dissection, where the animals who are dissected in schools come from, what happens to them before they make it to the schools. And so we did some research on suppliers of animals for dissection and found this BioCorp Corporation, where we went in and not just found the dead animals that they were injecting with formalin and things like this before shipping them to schools, but we were also able to expose that pigeons were drowned in an attempt to kill them, which is a horrible, cruel way to die, that crayfish were injected with latex dye as a method of killing, which is obviously cruel, and our position, of course, is that those things are illegal. And the turtles were being frozen alive, which is not just cruel with any animal, reptiles as well, and especially, but that they were then waking up and being refrozen. And so we have gone to authorities on that. And that was not a whistleblower investigation. So it all depends, on where the information comes from.
And without PETA stepping in that BioCorp situation in Minnesota, what is the status here? Was PETA able to shut down that facility?
Not yet, but it's currently under criminal investigation. We did go to court in order to we had to follow some unique process in Minnesota, go in front of a judge who then ordered police to investigate, and the investigation remains open.
Your investigations aren't just national, they're international and worldwide. And let's talk about, I guess you could call them some of your greatest hits. One of the high profile cases involved the U.S. Global Exotics Company in Texas, and 27,000 animals were involved, confiscated from this international exotic animal dealer. Tell me about that case. And that was something you were able to shut down. That
was something, thankfully, we were able to shut down. And that was actually a whistleblower case. The whistleblowers was someone who had visited or worked at the facility. But this was a facility involved in the international exotic pet trade. And it traded in animals as small as spiders and scorpions to animals as large as sloths and wallabies and kinkajous, coatimundis, and other exotic mammals who were wild caught and then shipped to this hideous facility, and oftentimes not even unpacked, but kept in those containers that they arrived in and then shipped elsewhere. The man who ran this facility, his name is Jason Shaw, and he was originally from New Zealand. And he just had absolutely zero regard for the animals. And he was essentially, just to give you an example, when we finally did raid the facility, which was 7 months after we entered it, but we had tried to get the facility addressed by authorities for 5 months and finally succeeded in December of 2009. In the garage of the facility, which was very, very cold, there were boxes upon boxes of iguanas, 200 or so iguanas who had been packed for a shipment to Egypt that never went out because the buyer never paid. And so these animals sat in boxes with no food, water, humidity, or heat for 2 weeks. And when we arrived at the facility with a team of experts and they unpacked those boxes, most of those animals were dead. But the ones who had survived, not all of them, most of them were dead when we arrived, and some of them didn't make it, even though we did our best. But that just gives you an example of the horrific neglect. There was no food at the facility. There was a rotten head of lettuce. There were reptiles, meaning snakes and turtles and lizards. And there were scorpions and spiders and sloths and hamsters and hedgehogs and chinchillas. I mean, he just, dealt in anything and everything that he could make a penny on with just absolutely no decency whatsoever. So it was a huge victory. It was a massive player in the international pet trade, and he was charged with smuggling, conspiracy, and fraud because of he essentially obviously was smuggling, but also was faking health certificates before shipping these animals out of the country. And those animals came in and out of virtually every continent. Wild caught, in South America, for example, for the sloths, and they would come in these tiny boxes with nothing, just completely traumatized, and then shoved into some other enclosure until they were sold to some buyer who knows what prompts people to buy animals like that. But it was a massive victory and a very, very hard-fought battle for these animals.
Now, you shut down the facility practically overnight. The operator, though, he's a federal fugitive, still at large. But what happened to the animals? What were you able to do with the animals that he was dealing with?
So the animals were seized by the SPCA of Texas along with the city of Arlington, and because of the legal process, it wasn't quite a trial, but the court proceeding. It took about 60 days before the animals were able to be dispersed, but they were dispersed to various groups. For example, there were 600 hedgehogs at the facility that we set up a big rescue facility at the SPCA of Texas.
And someone wanted 600 hedgehogs? I mean, you're able to place 600?
Believe it or not, there are groups that specialize in hedgehog rescue and placement. And the hedgehogs really stick in my mind because these groups came to Texas, and some of them they really sent volunteers who just helped with the setup, helped the expert with the setup, and they are so devoted to hedgehogs. And they came through and they ended up placing all of these hedgehogs. And this was it was wonderful for those animals who were rescued. Of course, the victory was also for the animals who would never be victimized by the pet trade. But it was also a very, very vital educational experience for people who are, say, passionate about hedgehogs, who are exotic. And these are folks who just had no idea, never gave a thought to where these animals came from. I mean, they just didn't think about it.
They were just blinded by Sonic the Hedgehog or something. And And
Who wouldn't be?
and the thing is, hedgehogs have rights, and that's one of the positive outcomes of the U.S. Global Exotics case. But you have had other victories, like Global Captive Breeders is another company that you investigated, and that was another huge victory for you with reptiles and 16,000 rats. I mean, tell us about the Global Captive Breeders case, because that's got to be right up there as one of your greatest hits.
It is, of course the victories are always so sweet for the animals who are liberated from these hellholes. But, personally, when you have to fight for something so hard and it's the right thing, and you've been up, night after night, strategizing and devising and cajoling authorities and offering help and fundraising to offer resources, the victory is so meaningful because it really just, it's justice, it's just justice unfolding, and Global Captive Breeders was a facility in Lake Elsinore, California. It did house between about 16,000 rats who were mostly being bred to be food, to be used as food for snakes. And the facility had two parts, and one part was a sort of warehouse for these rodents, and the other part was where the snakes were being housed. Both sections of the facility were absolutely filthy and reeked of infection and death. And that was really the same thing with U.S. Global Exotics, is the absolutely overpowering stench of death and infection and just disease when you walk in the door of these places. But Lake Elsinore authorities were quite resistant. We did have a good humane society on the ground, thankfully, who wanted to do a good job and the right thing. And what we found with that case, as well as the U.S. Global Exotics case, is that even when you have individuals within a law enforcement agency or a humane society who want to do the right thing, oftentimes they are completely paralyzed by their sheer just lack of knowledge about these exotic animals. This was particularly evident in Texas. And so, part of what we offer when we go into these situations is expert advice, an expert team, people that we bring in from sometimes in the same state, sometimes out of state, sometimes out of the country, people who can walk into a facility like that and know what they're looking at. And that was key in both cases. With the Lake Elsinore case, we were able to get a warrant executed at the facility, and then the animals were eventually seized. And it was, and in fact, the owner of the facility and the manager of the facility were both charged with nearly 100 felony cruelty to animals charges each. They eventually pled down and all of that. But in the end, really, not only were cruelty charges filed and they pled, but they had to pay PETA back for every cent we spent on the case, which was nice. But also the animals came out and they shut down. And so that, again, that's a player that goes out, and it's a warning, it's a wake up call for the industries that abuse animals in this way to know we're here and we're watching you. And if we come after you, you're going down.
Well, it was the largest seizure of rats in U.S. history, the largest ever seizure of animals in California. So that was really quite an investigation on behalf of your department. You also have done some looking into, say, other corporate places. I mean, those were kind of I don't want to say they're storage facilities as they transported animals, but I guess that's what they were. But you also went into labs, like at the Professional Laboratory and Research Services, PLRS in North Carolina. And this is kind of a warning for laboratories too, when PETA goes into investigations into those kind of sites.
Absolutely. That was a horrible place, something from medieval times.
So you also go into labs, is my point, not just these storage facilities as animals are transported. but in laboratories where people should know better.
Yes, they should know better everywhere, really. But yes, I take your point. Professional Laboratory Research Services was in Coral Peak, North Carolina. It was something from the medieval times. Just really something you wouldn't dream existed. It held hundreds of dogs, cats, and rabbits for experiments, and it not only were the conditions for the individual animals deplorable, but the staff at this lab, they were so mean. They were vicious with these animals, and we were able to capture video of these workers yelling, spraying, abusing these animals. Specifically, I recall a cat who was being, I think that they were trying to trim his nails or something, or they were trying to restrain him in some way that he didn't appreciate. And the woman who was holding him would put his paw around this chain link so that his claws would be wrapped around the metal. And then she would forcefully pull on his leg in order to hurt him on purpose. And just horrible, vicious people. And we did shut that down very shortly after we published the case, and the animals were released to actually our area shelters here, because this particular facility was not too far from where we're based in Virginia, although the facility was in North Carolina. And it was extremely gratifying to shut that place down. And that, again, was a wake-up call to the industry that does tests on animals for flea and tick medication, for example. And, you know, this was a facility that was subjecting rabbits to having basically ticks feed on them. They were breeding the ticks in order to assess the effectiveness of whatever they were testing. So it had no use whatsoever, and it was contracting with major corporations. So it's nice that that's a relic at the moment.
Well, you were able to close down that lab, but you also got a grand jury to indict 4 workers. It was the first time. Yeah, and it was the first time that ever happened. So now, what does that say to people who may want to work at labs and may see these kind of things? I guess they should all be whistleblowers, huh?
I hope so. I hope people know that they should blow the whistle when they see something wrong. And most definitely it is a wake-up call to the industry and the people who work in it that PETA is watching. And you never know who within you is watching, because people do call us. The PLRS case was a whistleblower call. The Lake Elsinore, the global captive breeders, that was also a whistleblower call. So it is very meaningful when people see something for them to say something and to never be silent, to speak up, because the animals can't do that. And when you see something that's wrong and you know that it's wrong, all you have to do is make a phone call.
So we're talking about places where animals are stored, places like in other places like laboratories, but you also went to the factory farms, the food factories, specifically the pig factory farm that's run by or that supplies Hormel. And tell us about that investigation, because I think people still are, if they haven't gone vegan or gone vegetarian, then they may still eat meat. They need to know what's going on and how the food is being processed at some of these factory farms. So tell us about the Hormel case, or the supplier to Hormel, and what you found when you went to Iowa to look at a pig factory farm.
Yeah, we investigated a pig factory farm, and I believe it was Greene County, Iowa. This was in 2008 or so, and this was a pig farm that had, most of the farms that we look at that house pigs have a farrowing side, and then a side where they basically have the pigs, and then the side where they have the pigs who are pregnant. And so we ended up having an observer and eyewitness work on each side, which allowed us to really see not just both, aspects of the operation, but where the abuse takes place, systematically, is when these poor sows are being forced to move from one side to the other. And if you can imagine, I mean, these are animals who don't move very much because they're in tiny little cages all the time. And so when they are moved into the farrowing side, which is where they are again in cages, farrowing crates or gestation crates, and they really cannot move. These are animals whose muscles have atrophied, who have been bred and raised to be heavier than they should be, because the companies want to make money off of their meat per pound. And so they're afraid. They're afraid of the men who work there, who don't show them kindness. They're sore and their muscles are atrophied and they don't move quickly. And so the men get very frustrated with them, which is what we showed in our investigation, is that these poor sows were beaten and abused, including sexually, when we were at this facility. And we also documented, other things. We documented very poor methods of killing piglets who are, the industry essentially disposes of piglets who don't make a certain weight by 3 weeks of age. And the manner in which the industry allows these farms to dispose of them is to thump them, essentially killing them by blunt force trauma, which means someone has to take this tiny piglet who's, maybe the size of a football, and grab them by the hind legs and just with all your might slam their head against the floor. And the man who was tasked with this, grim task was very half-hearted about it, which meant that these animals survived the thumping, and he would put them all in a bucket and just leave them there to die. And so one of the things that our eyewitness documented is this bucket of, dying piglets struggling to breathe and survive one on top of another. And that was, that's the tip of the iceberg. And these are typical abuses in the factory farming industry. So if one hasn't gone vegan yet, PETA.org will be a huge help.
Well, you said something that kind of struck me. You said there was also sexual abuse of the pigs by the workers?
There was sexual abuse by the workers, yes. And this is not necessarily, this was not an isolated incident. We have, in every investigation that we've done, there's always sort of like bizarre sexual innuendos and just strange behavior on part of the workers. But there were descriptions by workers of workers penetrating sows with crowbars and things like that. So it's, obviously, totally appalling. I mean, the entire operation is something out of a horror movie. I mean, you've got, when we say factory farm, we don't mean, a dozen or 100 pigs. It's a massive, massive warehouse that contains 6,000 plus pigs. And I mean, it is literally a factory farm, and these animals are seen as nothing but meat production.
And so I guess if someone witnessed the sexual harassment of a sow, I guess you don't go to HR. You just hope there's a PETA undercover person there documenting it so that you could stop it. I mean, the grand jury, I understand, or actually there were 6 workers that admitted guilt in that whole case. And it was the first convictions of their kind in Iowa. So
that's right. And Iowa is the top pig producing state in the nation. And this was, believe it or not, because this was the first investigation I supervised when I took over undercover investigation. So it's a very vivid and, a significant memory for me. And I flew to Iowa to meet with the sheriff's office, and I was joined by someone from the Animal Rescue League in Des Moines, which is a wonderful outfit. And the sheriff's deputy whom I met with, who has since retired, had grown up on a pig farm. And he was appalled. He was appalled by the footage I showed him and the photos I showed him. And, it was significant to have these people charged. It was significant that they pled guilty. And it was significant that this happened in Iowa. And this was a real, the industry itself published a piece in one of their publications that said, this is a wake-up call. This is a wake-up call for our industry. So it was extremely significant for a number of reasons.
Well, that was in 2008. What kind of wake-up call has it been, or have people fallen back asleep?
Well, there's so much more waking up to do, right? These factory farms and these slaughterhouses are going to continue to exist until people stop eating animals, and it's really that simple. So it's up to the consumer to make a difference in that way. PETA is here, and PETA is always going to be watching people who abuse animals and shine a spotlight on that. But the bottom line is that if people are concerned about animals who are factory farmed and slaughtered for their flesh or used, for dairy or egg-laying hens, the most basic and easiest thing to do is to go vegan, because there is no humane way for these animals to be farmed like this. And it doesn't matter what claims the companies are making, and they are making some pretty rich claims. The bottom line is that stop thinking about your palate.
Daphna Nachminovich, Senior Vice President and Head of PETA's Cruelty Investigations, on how PETA and whistleblowers like you have stopped wholesale supply operations, laboratories, and even factory farms, although there's still much more to be done. And as Daphna said, thinking about going vegan may be the loudest whistle you can blow to halt the meat production of factory farming. For information on becoming vegan and information about taking action in general, go to PETA.org. Contact me on Twitter at Emil Guillermo. Once again, thank you for listening. Go to our podcast player, fill out the survey. It's feedback that will help us grow the show. And don't forget to share a link with friends and let them know there's a voice for the animals on the PETA Podcast. Our music is provided by Carbonworks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.